Your Bibles with me to the Philippians text that is the lesson for today. It is Philippians, the 3rd chapter, verses 12 through 16. Not that I have already obtained all this or have already arrived at my goal, but I press on to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus took hold of me. Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. All of us then, who are mature, should take such a view of things. And if on some point you think differently, that too God will make clear to you. Only let us live up to what we have already attained. The reading for the day. It is an honor to be back here, to be with you today, to be back after, almost 6 years since we worshiped here. It's been a long time. And when I drove in and then parked, it was almost like coming home. To be back in the parking lot and then to walk into the building and see David right away and to see Wendy and others, it is a joy to be here. Jarrett and I have thought about you every Sunday since we were last here. And when Pastor Patrick learned that I had been on a pilgrimage to civil rights sites, he invited me to come, and I said yes right away because I wanted to be here with you and to share that experience of people rising up. So much has happened in the 6 years since we were here. The world is not as secure as I certainly believed it to be. At the risk of alienating anybody, I can really only speak for myself as I look back over the past 6 years and indeed over my lifetime. The lens through which I look, obviously, is that of an African American. My family has been able to identify that we started, or at least a part of our family, began in Sierra Leone and were brought here as slaves. Throughout my life, the proclamation in my family has always been education. 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 And if you forget, it's education. That was the proclamation in my family. With education, you move forward in society. With education comes acceptance. With education comes so many things, and yet education did not change the color of my skin, not that I wanted it to. It didn't change the fact that when people see me, the first thing they see is somebody who's black. My education does not easily change somebody's already preconceived ideas of who I am, what my needs are, or what my desires might be. I know that my contribution, my impact, my influence, my very being causes some people to be fearful, to think that I'm uppity, or to believe that I have taken more than my share of the American dream. Some people who don't know me already hate me. Some who don't know me don't listen to me when I say that me or people like me are hurting, and the system, whatever system it might be, whatever institution it might be, when we say that it's broken, unjust, and just plain wrong. Instead, there are those who organize against me and people who look like me, wanting society to be as it was perhaps even before Jim Crow. And so I've often wondered over the past few years, what did I miss? What did I miss while I was pursuing education as that one activity that my family lifted up to say it would level the playing field? What did I miss? What did I miss that makes some people hesitant and other people refuse to consider me as somebody who has value, someone who might be equal? What did I miss that I didn't take into account? Some people might not understand what I learned. One of my first learnings as a 3-year-old at Bethel Lutheran Church in Chicago, that I should love the Lord with all my heart and my neighbor as myself. What in the world did I miss? And so even before this past October, I was on something of a pilgrimage to learn something I hadn't already learned, something I didn't already know of the particular type of racism that is so much a part of my history, a history that I might have wanted to ignore but could not. A history that is really everyone's history if you live here in the United States, since it is woven into the very fiber of our nation. And even though we might not have said, yes, this is the way it should be, it has been woven into who we are, our very being. Lately, I've been living with Psalm 13, a song of David as he lamented his feelings of isolation, being alone and distant from God and left to wrestle with his thoughts and the deep sorrow in his heart, while at the same time knowing the sureness of God's unfailing love. Psalm 13, how long, O Lord? How long will you forget me? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. This psalm has been a passage lifted up by those whose experiences has placed them on the edge of society, where their gifts and the richness of being citizens has not always been theirs. If there's anyone in the Bible that we can identify with, I think it's David with his vulnerabilities and his humanity. Who among us hasn't felt despair and soul-filling agony? Maybe we can't name it or touch it, but we felt it deep down inside, a kind of twist in our gut, that this protected world that we thought we had as youth might have been an illusion. And so we started in Birmingham. This pilgrimage began in Birmingham. 45 of us and a driver would climb on a bus that would take us from Birmingham to Memphis. We came from 19 different states in the country, from California to Florida, Maine to Washington. We were mostly white, a handful of us were black, and 2 of us were Eastern Indian. We were Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, agnostic, atheist. The youngest among us was 29, the oldest was 83. We covenanted with each other that among other things, we would assume a positive intent on the part of fellow participants. We would speak from our own experiences, ask questions from a standpoint of holy curiosity, and not ask others to speak as experts on their particular race, culture, or ethnicity. And we would recognize that our personal truths might not be the same as somebody else's. We were introduced to the staff and learned that one of the five of us was present in 1963 and was among the participants of Project C, Birmingham's children's movement to protest the segregation laws. Children exited the 16th Street Baptist Church singing songs as they danced and marched into Kelly Ingram Park across the street from the church. These children were at the direction of the Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, fire-hosed and set upon by dogs. 3 girls died that day, and 2 boys died as a result of their wounds later. At the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute on another side of the park, a man who had to have been in his 80s and whose job it was to just usher people along through the exhibits, stood there and answered when I asked him. I said, "You know, you must have seen a lot of changes over the years." And his answer was, "Yeah, but not enough." What he didn't say, but could be heard in the weariness of his voice, was, "How long, Lord? How long?" Kelly Ingram Park is now a peaceful place, even with the memorials and the statues that tell the story. The bus took us from from Birmingham to Montgomery and the Rosa Parks Museum. Rosa Parks is the woman whose refusal to give up her seat on a bus in 1955 ignited a bus boycott, which lasted almost 13 months. Amazing to me was the organization it took to pull off this boycott and have it last 13 months. The leadership of the Montgomery Improvement Association asked for 3 things, only 3 things. 1, that there be more driver courtesy toward Black passengers. 2, that there might be a first come, first served seating from the front to the back for whites and from the back to the front for Blacks. And 3, that there would be drivers, Black drivers, for routes going into Black neighborhoods. None of those demands called for an end to segregation, but the demands were rejected. The bus company and the city commissioners escalated the conflict with petty laws. I mean, they would do things like saying if 2 or more people were gathered together on a street corner waiting for someone to pick them up, they could be ticketed for loitering, arrested, or a driver would be ticketed because of the color of his car. So the Black leaders called for more sweeping changes. The bus company was losing over $3,000 a day in bus fares. But it was about power. It wasn't even about the money. It was about power. They preferred to lose the money than lose the power they were given because of the rules of segregation. When the boycott ended, the Montgomery Improvement Association issued guidelines for riding the buses, warning Black people to not boast, to remain calm at all times, and to exercise nonviolence. The museum, I have to admit, left me feeling pretty up. Afterwards, I was finally able to fill in a big gap in my personal knowledge. You see, my family's claim to fame was that for one brief moment, Rosa Parks had been a part of our lives. She was in Chicago sometime in the mid-'60s to speak at a rally, and the planners met in my living room. She was a guest in our home. But I wasn't even a teenager yet, and I didn't understand the significance of her being there. And I didn't learn until this trip back in October from a sister who was also on the trip with me why my mother had decided to safeguard a particular chair in our living room with plastic slipcovers. You see, that was the chair that Rosa Parks sat in. It's a learning. Then we went to the Equal Justice Initiative National Memorial for Peace and Justice. The memorial is also known as the Lynching Museum. Metal columns, each representing a county in the United States where there were lynchings, were hung in a semi-covered arena, a large outdoor space. To see the columns, you had to walk in circles, in rings around this arena, and upon each column, there were engraved the names and the dates of those who had been lynched. Over 4,000 known and documented lynchings from the early 1800s through the early 1960s were represented on these columns. As I walked around the arena, as I walked deeper into the columns, I felt compelled to pay homage to those whose names were on them. I began by touching the first column and reading the names, and then the second one, and then the third one, and then it occurred to me that what I was doing was acknowledging that they lived. As if I were to say, today, you are not forgotten. I am here to say you lived. But there were too many to touch. There were too many columns to touch, too many names to read, too many people represented by the word unknown. There were too many people killed just because they were Black. I remembered then, having learned just the day before, although it seemed like it had been a lifetime before, two of the commandments of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights pledge, the things that people had to sign on to in order to participate in this area of civil rights. One of them was that it was not about it was about justice and reconciliation. It wasn't about victory. Justice and reconciliation, not victory. And that the other one, there were 10 altogether, but these two, the other one was that one should refrain from violence of the fist, the tongue, and the heart. And you had to sign that pledge. And I remembered my earliest learning at church to love my neighbor. And right then, all I could do was feel the weight of those columns as they raised higher and higher and higher. And I felt my neck being stretched up and up and up. And I felt the weight of all those killings. All the hopes and all the dreams that would never be. All I could think of was, I don't understand this kind of hatred or evil or whatever it's called. Toward the end of the arena, attached to walls, there were plaques listing the reasons for the lynchings. For some, there were a few that I'll just mention. For speaking with a white woman. For complaining to the sheriff that a cow had been stolen. For living with or marrying a white woman. For arguing with a neighbor. For being present when someone was being looked for who wasn't there. For asking a white woman for a drink of water. For just hanging around in a white neighborhood. All this time, I had been stoic, holding in the emotions, trying to honor those who had been murdered with my acknowledgement of them. And then there was a large table, maybe about the size of this aisle, only about 8 feet long, I don't know. There was this table, and it was encased in glass, but inside it was dirt. Dirt. Samples of dirt taken from the counties where there had been lynchings. And I couldn't hold it in anymore. How long, O God, will you forget your people? How long will you allow your face to be hidden from all your creation when it comes to the beautiful differences in people that you have created? Me and people who look like me and those with skin tones different than mine. How long will it be before we learn how to be with each other, to coexist in a world where it seems someone has to be on the bottom and some other people have to be on top? How long? We need enlightenment, because we surely don't know how to do this. A few miles away, in the Legacy Museum, from slavery to mass incarceration, the point was very forcefully made that mass incarceration is the new form of lynching. It was almost too much to take after the time spent at the lynching memorial. How many of you here, anybody see Just Mercy? A few people. I highly recommend it to you. I highly recommend it, or the book by the same name. The movie features an attorney, Brian Stevenson, as he worked to help get the release from prison a fellow who had been unjustly imprisoned and incorrectly imprisoned or incorrectly convicted. Stevenson wrote the book, Just Mercy. He's featured in the movie. He's also the executive director of the Legacy Museum. And again, I highly recommend the book or the movie to you. As I sat down to prepare for the day, I soon realized that this experience that I wanted to talk about, of this pilgrimage really could not be contained in 20 minutes, generally given over to the time for the sermon. The history of the civil rights movement, which began in the mid-1950s and continued through the 1960s, is a deep and a many-faceted one. The history is so complex. The experience is one that I am still unpacking, one that is still having a profound effect on me, a profound impact on my thoughts and my emotions and my actions. There's no way I can adequately share in the time we have together all that I've learned, all that I saw, all that I experienced. The history of the movement may well be filled with death and with disenfranchisement, but it's also filled, as our young women said who danced here, it's filled with hope, and it's filled with light, and with people who embody the spirit that David sang of when he sings of his trust in God's unfailing love and how his heart rejoices in God's salvation. On the day that we walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, I began to look at people who marched and demonstrated not as people larger than life, but simply as people who celebrated the lives that they had been given. People like you and people like me. I met people who lived in some of these places I visited, who had moved away for a while but returned because it was their home. We met a woman who became a registrar for voter registration, who worked to change the system that still today seeks to suppress the right to vote for Black people. We met the daughter of James Chaney, who along with Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman were in their early 20s when they were killed because they were freedom riders. They were working to get people registered to vote. Angela Chaney Lewis was a newborn baby when her father was killed. He had just barely seen her. But as she grew and learned her history, she spoke of love and for her refusal to allow the hatred and the bitterness and the violence to consume and define her. We met by way of the telephone the daughter of slain civil rights leader Medgar Evers, who was killed at his front door as he got out of his car at his home and was able to pull himself into the house where he died. Rena Evers had hoped to be with us, but she had a terrible cold, so she wasn't, but she called. And she spoke of the house where her family lived as a place of love, where Evers was not the leader of a movement, but where he was a husband, a father, a man. And she thanked us. She thanked us for being on this pilgrimage and experiencing not just the injustice, but the desire people had and have for justice and reconciliation. We met Joanne Bland, who was the youngest person ever to have been jailed during any demonstration during this time. At the age of 11, Joanne had already been arrested 13 times. Joanne and her 15-year-old sister Linda participated in the attempted march from Selma to Birmingham to Montgomery on what has become known as Bloody Sunday. You've heard of that? When marchers were to take their grievances to the state capitol, only to be met by police and state troopers as they attempted to cross the Pettus Bridge. They were met with cattle prods, clubs, and sticks. The crowd was so big that as they crested the bridge going down the far side, those in the rear didn't know what was happening up front. And so as people in front turned to run from the attack, they stampeded each other. They trampled each other as those in the rear kept coming. Joanne didn't know until she and her sister had managed to get away, crying and exhausted, that the drops falling from her sister's face were not tears but blood. 2 weeks later, Linda, after 35 stitches on her face and head, joined with those who would finally make that march, and she was the youngest person to complete it. We met a man who as a child was enamored of the freedom riders. He reminded me of my grandchildren who love superheroes because he thought the freedom riders were superheroes because every time they were incarcerated, they would come out and they would get right back into the fight. And so he knew there must be something supernatural about them. He was a kid when he was first arrested at the age of 13. And he was arrested because he had gone to the train station, the bus station, to see, he thought he had heard that the freedom riders were there. He went there to see them. And he was arrested. He was immediately put on death row. It was 5 days before he was released through the assistance of Robert Kennedy. He was so young and so naive that he hadn't known what it meant to be on death row. He was in a cell with 2 other men who stole his breakfast and sexually abused him. To this day, he said he has not told his family what happened to him in that cell. And he laments the fact that his mother never got to know and be proud of him because he became a freedom rider. Even so, he still carries the shame of what happened to him 50 years ago. These ordinary people celebrated and celebrate the lives they've been given. They could let the pain, the hatred, the violence, the insensitivity, the injustice make them militant, hateful, and destructive toward others, but instead, they stand for wholeness, for life, for justice, and for equality. There are others whose lives or deaths we got to explore some. Names you might know: Fred Shuttlesworth, for whom the Birmingham airport is named; Viola Liuzzo, who was a nurse from Detroit who responded to Martin Luther King's call for people to come to Selma to walk across the bridge after Bloody Sunday; Reverend James Reeb, who was killed in Selma; Jimmy Lee Jackson, whose death was the reason the march from Selma to Montgomery existed in the first place; Emmett Till, we've heard that name a lot, 14 or 15-year-old boy; Fannie Lou Hamer. Only a few people whose lives and deaths made a difference to the civil rights movement. The pilgrimage ended at the National Museum of Civil Rights at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, with exhibits that explored the years of the movement and Martin Luther King's death. At this point, we were all consumed, beyond consumed and overwhelmed. The last hall of the exhibit showcased the fight for freedom and equality, not just for Black people, but for those who are physically disabled, for those who are of Native descent, for women, and for those in the LGBT community. Now, I'm aware I haven't spoken of the people with whom I journeyed or the small groups we met in at the end of each evening to unpack the day. I've not spoken of the music of the civil rights movement that was part of our daily bus ride and our presentations from people, and one of the staff led us in the singing. These songs were there to give us energy and to help us unpack awful moments, to accompany the pain and the joy of our learning. And I haven't spoken of the lunchrooms or the buffets where we ate each day. Or, since we were in the South, the peach cobbler that none of us could get enough of. What sticks with me, however, and what gives me hope, and what compels me to tell this story, is the spirit of the people that we met along the way. There's something about having wrestled with a personal history, fear of the impermanence of life, fear of neighbors who might be members of the Ku Klux Klan, and having to live a life that was extremely fragile, hungering for something more important than the day-to-day existence that they were living, and that in this time, in this country, in that region of the country, they were able to live to show grace, an understanding of God that is almost incomprehensible to me and those who don't have that history, and yet it is part of our history. But these people, like David, sang of trust in God's unfailing love and rejoiced in the salvation that God had given them. And as I said, this is our history too. At our last group gathering, as we briefly tried, no matter how ineloquently, to articulate what we had learned and what, if anything, our next personal steps might be, we were aware of at least two gifts that we had been given. The first is a small, tangible piece of history. It's a rock, and mine is maybe as big as my small fingernail. It's a rock from the lot where the people gathered in Selma before setting out to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Joanne Bland gave one of these rocks to each of us, explaining that we would carry the history with us and that now that history was part of us. The second gift was a small checker-sized wooden disc that was given to us from a fellow pilgrim. It was the wife of a rabbi. They were both part of the trip. Printed in both Hebrew and English, maybe you've seen it. On one side, it states, "It's not up to you to finish the work." On the other side, it states, "But neither are you free to give up." And I would add that there's a third gift. A third gift made tangible by the witness of those we met and whose lives were taken. It was a desire for all of us to give thanks for the experience, for the people both alive and dead, for the cause of justice. And for me and those who are able, thanks for the ability to sing the Lord's praise, recognizing that the Lord has been so good to us. And so my prayer for all of you is that you allow God to equip you for the ministry of wholeness and reconciliation, not just for yourselves, but for all of God's creation. And the people of God say, Amen.